This is Malta, this is its history, here's what you gotta know. The islands of Malta had been there pretty much forever, but they weren't inhabited until around 5900 BC, when some people came over on boats from probably Sicily and started setting up settlements. Those settlements eventually failed because the soil got too bad. The population wouldn't come back for another 2,000 years when more Sicilians arrived on Malta, and this time began constructing large temples called megaliths for various religious purposes. Malta then hung around for another 3,000 years, and yes, that is a long time, before finally one of the big societies realized they existed. In the 700s BC, some Phoenicians arrived, and then a century later explorers from the Phoenician city-state of Carthage arrived on and actually colonized Malta. And finally Malta became known to Europe under the name Malta, which probably was named by the Greeks. During the Second Punic War in the 200s BC, however, Carthage was conquered by the Roman Empire, and thus Malta was conquered by Rome as well. Malta continued to exist for another few hundred years, developing their society under Roman influence as they started to mix some Latin into their language. During the turn into the AD times, Malta continued to do pretty well under the Roman colonization, but unfortunately going into the 400s AD, the Roman Empire collapsed and Malta was independent. But fear not, Malta would become colonized once again as soon as 533 AD, when a Byzantine general named Belisarius arrived via boat to Malta. Belisarius thought that he was just on another Sicilian island, so he claimed all of those islands as part of Sicily in the Byzantine Empire. Malta remained a part of the Byzantine Empire until the late 800s, when Aghlabid Muslims from Tunisia arrived on Malta and conquered it. Unfortunately, the Maltese citizens were used to the Byzantine way of living, so having an entirely new lifestyle being forced upon them by invaders for like the fourth time in its history, yeah, it was not favored by the Maltese, and they resisted. This, however, led to almost the entire population of Malta being wiped out by the Aghlabids, and Malta's population wouldn't return to its former numbers for over 200 years. In the late 11th century, knights from Normandy attempted to liberate Malta from Aghlabid control and bring it back to the Catholic Church sphere of influence, and they actually managed to succeed. Now that Malta was back on the market, the Italian peninsula came back looking when Roger II, King of Sicily, claimed Malta as a province of the Kingdom of Sicily. In the 1500s, the Ottoman Empire was the biggest fear in Europe, and Charles V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, was afraid that the Ottomans might target Malta as an invasion point to use as a base to plan attacks on Rome. In 1530, he decided to combat this by sending a bunch of knights from the Roman Knights Hospitaller to Malta to defend the island. Unfortunately, in 1565, what Charles V had feared finally happened. Suleiman's army of Ottoman soldiers laid siege to Malta in the biggest event in the country's history. The Knights of Malta had over 35 years to plan for this, and they repelled the siege with surprising speed along with some random civilians who fought with whatever weapons they had, the original Minutemen. Less than a year later, the Knights of Malta and the Maltese citizens managed to repel over 40,000 Ottoman soldiers, and the siege was ended. The people of Malta decided they need better fortifications in their city, so they constructed a new city with amazing fortifications, and they called the city Valletta, and it becomes the new capital. Meanwhile, the Knights of Malta became the primary defense for Malta, and they remained that way for almost 300 years. Trouble struck Malta at the end of the 1700s when French General Napoleon Bonaparte was making a voyage from France to Egypt, and in 1798 Napoleon and his crew stopped on Malta. Their crew was apparently thirsty and tried to get some drinking water from the locals, and for some reason the locals refused. In response to this, Napoleon set up a brigade around Valletta, and within 3 days the Grand Master of Valletta was forced to sign a treaty with Napoleon that signed off the entire country of Malta to the control of France so Napoleon wouldn't attack Valletta. So to reiterate, Napoleon just conquered Malta because they wouldn't give him water. Anyways, France conquering Malta turned out to not be such a bad thing for Malta, as they actually had some pretty major developments to their country and infrastructure. However, the French did destroy some churches and steal some important Maltese artifacts, which angered the Maltese people, who rebelled and demanded independence, which they actually received in 1800, not even 2 years after becoming part of France. But then not even a year later, Malta voluntarily asked to become a British protectorate, and Britain agreed to it, and Britain eventually used Malta as a strategic base for stopovers once the Suez Canal opened in 1869. Once the fighting for the First World War began, Malta stayed relatively far away from any fighting. However, the British did place military headquarters for the British Royal Navy on Malta and also established some military hospitals for wounded warriors. During the Second World War, however, Malta had a problem. While the British Royal Navy headquarters had been removed from the country, it was still in Allied territory in the middle of the Italian and German shipping lines, and a little too close to Sicily, which subjected the island to air raids from Italy. Despite this, Malta was able to defend itself pretty well with the assistance of some British aircraft. After World War II, Malta's political system had a noticeable lean towards complete independence. A lot of Maltese politicians and people were against this since they enjoyed the benefits provided by the British, but then in 1953 one major event happened that would prove to be a turning point in Maltese politics. In 1953, Queen Elizabeth II was coronated as the Queen of the United Kingdom, and members of Parliament from every British protectorate except for Malta were invited to her coronation. While not a major issue, a lot of Maltese politicians and people felt betrayed by Britain, and in 1964 a referendum was held to determine if Malta should become an independent country, and a majority of people voted in favor of independence, which came into effect on September 21st of that year. And then finally in 2004, Malta joined the EU. Now it's just an island that people, mostly from Italy, visit sometimes, and most people don't even realize is home to temples that are older than the Stonehenge, and it's also got a pretty unique blend of all of the different cultures that have taken it over.